Are we waiting on one of our guests, John?
No, we will be one guest down this evening. Tyler Logan from Hope Network had something come up at the last minute, so he's unable to join us.
Oh, bummer.
All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time out of your evening to join us. Excuse me. My name is Jonathan Epley, and I am chair of the Big Rapids Social Equity Initiatives Community Engagement Committee. Hey, not right now, sweetie. Sorry, I've got a little helper this morning, or this evening rather. So you may see her pop in and out. But tonight's event is titled Disability Awareness in Big Rapids. It is organized by the Big Rapids Social Equity Initiatives Community Engagement Committee. And I have a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. First, if it's not your turn to speak, please keep your microphone muted unless you are called upon to speak. Sometimes we've had that happen where audience members ask some questions during the panel discussion, which is okay. If you do have a question in the middle of the panel discussion, we ask that you please put it in the chat instead of just blurting it out or using the raise hand feature. If those questions do come in, I'll be handling those. But otherwise, we ask that all questions be held toward the end of the panel discussion, where we have an open Q&A format. We are excited to host an insightful and engaging discussion on a topic that is important to very many people in our community. And with your participation and encouragement to ask questions, we welcome your participation and encouragement to ask questions to our panelists. We want this to be an inclusive and safe, inviting event, and we ask that everybody use respectful and sensitive language, both verbal and nonverbal. Sweetheart, not right now. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Antoinette Epps, our moderator for the evening, and she will get us started. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this very timely discussion on our communities and its engagement with individuals with disabilities. I am a professor at Ferris State University, and it's been my privilege over the last year to serve as moderator for these sessions. I am sad to tell you that this is the last session that I will moderate. I will be leaving Ferris at the end of this semester, so I won't be in the community anymore after the end of this semester. It was a very difficult decision, but I got an opportunity in Indianapolis, Indiana. It was actually just too good to pass up. So I'm leaving Ferris to go and do what I did Ferris, just a different university. But I want to thank Jonathan. I would like to thank Mayor Hoganson and everyone in the committee and in the city who's given me the opportunity to learn so much more about the community. It has been an absolute blessing, and I appreciate it so very much. So thank you very much. And I just wanted to share that with everyone so that it doesn't come as a surprise and you've heard it from the horse's mouth, as it were. This evening we have two panelists who are very experienced in the area of disabilities, either from a professional or personal standpoint. And we are very appreciative of them taking the time this evening to speak with us. The format that we're going to use, I will introduce the two guests in alphabetical order. After I introduce the first guest, she will have an opportunity to say anything that she'd like, the introduction to the group, followed by our second panelist. And after that, we have a list of prepared questions that we'll go through. So without any further ado, our first panelist is Julie Alexander. Julie is Director of Accessibility and Disability Services at Ferris State University. She has a bachelor's in psychology and a master's in professional counseling. She attended Central Michigan for both of her degrees. She has worked with students with disabilities in higher education for over 10 years and has been in her current role at Ferris since April 2020. She is passionate about breaking down barriers and supporting students of all abilities into their full participation in higher education. And Julie, if you'd like to say a few words by way of introduction of yourself, you're free to do so.
All right, thank you, Antoinette. Good evening, everybody. My name is Julie Alexander, and I will just visually describe myself briefly. I am a white woman with long brown hair. I'm wearing a black blouse and a multicolored crystal necklace. I'm in my home office. There are degrees and things on the wall. And one thing that those of you who are sighted maybe can't see that well is I have a bunch of colorful words behind me. And what that is that's my reframing disability words. And so some of the words, I'm not going to read them all to you, but they're things like inclusion, diversity, equity, paradigm change, reclaiming pride. So things like that, things that I hope, words that I hope will be part of this disability conversation and become more part of the disability narrative, especially pride and reclaiming. And I know there's questions for us, the panelists that we're going to talk about tonight. I'm hoping this will be engaging with all of those who are participating, and if people want to weigh in, especially if disability is something personal to you and you have that lived experience, I'm hoping that we as panelists can hear from and learn from you as well. So thank you for having me tonight.
Thank you so very much for joining us again. And our second panelist is Melissa Howard Langworthy. Melissa is a resident of Hershey, and she's the parent of a son with a disability. She grew up in Big Rapids area, and is married to her high school sweetheart, Gerald. They were married in 1990. After graduating from WMU with a Bachelor of Science in Education, she had two sons, Philip and Matthew. Tragedy struck in 2002 when Gerald and both boys were involved in a serious car accident. Philip, then 6 years old, broke his neck and became a quadriplegic. Melissa has since been involved in disability ministries, including Joni and Friends and Through the Roof. In conjunction with Crossroads Theater of Reed City, she established Celebrate Ability, a talent show for people with disabilities. And Melissa, we invite you now to tell us whatever you'd like us to know about you that wasn't in the little bio.
Thank you, Antoinette. This opportunity means a lot to me. As watching my son grow up with disability and learning so much about other families with disabilities, it's so important that people like you want to hear our stories. So thank you.
And thank you as well. So as I said, we have a list of prepared questions, and what we ask, as I ask the questions in turn, is if the panelists would take turns. Melissa answer first after one question, and Julie answer second. And on the next question, Julie answer first, Melissa answer, and so forth. So that everyone, one person doesn't always get the chance to go first, so sort of give that even-handedness to the process. So the first question is, could you describe the environment for job seeking and for accommodations in the Big Rapids-Mecosta County area? And Melissa, if you would go first.
All right, thank you. We have some great resources in this area. I have known people involved with Hope Network, with MOARC, and continuing education, and they were able to find really good jobs in an area that they enjoyed. It's a little bit harder for those with physical disabilities like my son. Unless you have a college education, most entry-level jobs involve some sort of physical labor. And so it is real challenge, and it was. He's living down in Grand Rapids at the moment, and he had a vocational trainer. They really worked hard to try to get him a job because, so many of them he just can't do. So I think those with physical disabilities are going to have a little bit harder time.
Okay, thank you. Julie?
Yes, thank you. So the first thing I want to say is it should be good. It should be easy to get a job. We have a labor shortage right now, right? So there's an abundance of jobs out there that people can do. But you know, and if you are an individual who is qualified and can do the essential functions of the job with or without an accommodation, then you should be able to find a job, apply for, and have a good competitive chance at getting that job. Individuals can ask for accommodations through the human resources, and you know, and they decide at what point they want to ask for those accommodations. Unfortunately, even though we have the Americans with Disabilities Act, even though we have accommodations for people with disabilities in the workplace, we still see a really large discrepancy when it comes to the job market. So disability is still getting in the way when it shouldn't. Now, I understand if a person cannot do essential job tasks, but in many cases they can, but still aren't getting the jobs. And in 2020, people with disabilities were employed at 17.9%, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, compared to people without disabilities at 61.8%. So that's a huge discrepancy. So the reasons for that, I don't think are that people can't be accommodated. I think people can be accommodated. Melissa mentioned some resources, including vocational rehabilitation. You know, we have Michigan Rehabilitative Services who can do quite a bit to help people find employment and get accommodations. But I think there's a more subtle problem when it comes to discrimination against people with disabilities in the workplace. And you see it, you know, even in job descriptions. And, you know, Melissa was talking about, you know, how difficult it might be for those with physical disabilities. But I think even for people with other types of disabilities, when you see a job description that says, we're looking for a high energy person to work in a fast-paced environment, that's kind of coded language. I mean, think about who that excludes. People with chronic health conditions, people with mental health conditions, people with mobility impairments, and a lot of other people who maybe just don't move as fast. And so you wonder, is that energy important to the essential job tasks? I'm not so sure about that. But we kind of give those subtle messages of who is not welcome here, who shouldn't apply. Disclosure of disability shouldn't be a big deal, but I think people are very nervous when they're writing their cover letters or going into interviews. Like, do I say now that I have a disability? I don't want them, I want to get accommodations. I'm going to have to let them know at some point, but I don't want them to judge me too quickly because disability is seen as negative when it should be neutral, even if it has nothing to do with the essential tasks of the job. So, as I said, I think the environment should be much better than it is. I don't think that the problem is that people can't be accommodated. I think there's a lot of problems with attitudes and discrimination against people with disabilities.
Julie, you quoted some numbers from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. I'm assuming those are national numbers. Do we have any idea what the local numbers are?
That's a good question. I do not know.
Just wondered. Thank you so much for both of you for those responses. The second question, what kinds of challenges do individuals with disabilities face on a daily basis in a small town like Big Rapids? Have you or your family member or individuals that you've worked with experienced discrimination throughout your journey. And this, of course, you've already, you're going to go first this time, but you've already described some subtle forms of discrimination. So if you could elaborate on that further in your answer, we'd appreciate it. You go first this time.
Sure, thank you. So I think one of the first things that I will mention, well, one way that people are blatantly discriminated against is when they hear the words, and this might be on a job, or this might be in the classroom. And I've talked to students who have heard this from professors in the classroom, where somebody has said, I just don't think this class is a good fit for you. It has nothing to do with how well your ability to comprehend the material. It has nothing to do with your ability to learn. It has everything to do with the way we've designed the class. And so it's not a good fit for you. And that is blatantly discriminatory. And that's a message that people get a lot. Well, this just is class for somebody with a disability, or this isn't really the right work environment for somebody with a disability. Our website's not really accessible, but we don't have a lot of people with disabilities who use our website, so we don't worry about it. And the reason you don't have a lot of people with disabilities using your website is because it's not accessible. So there's kind of a, if you build it, they will come. You make the environment accessible for all, inclusive for all, and then more people will come. So the challenges that individuals experience in addition to that on a daily basis in a small town, a lack of community. I think that's a big thing. It's not that there aren't people with disabilities, but it is like any marginalized community. It can be hard to find others who share that identity, especially if that identity is marginalized to the point that people don't want to claim it openly. And so that makes it hard to find people to relate to speak with. There's also a lot of, sometimes people don't know what to do with disability, right? Because it's not talked about enough, because it's not seen often enough. Then you get people either avoiding disability, kind of giving those subtle messages that we don't want you here. But then sometimes you also get the reverse of that, which is something called tokenism, where you intentionally, well, I want to include you because you have a disability. We want to be seen as inclusive, so we're going to invite you for that reason, not because we like you, not because we think that you have value apart from that, but because you have a disability. So that's kind of the reverse. Another thing you get in communities where you don't see a lot of disability is sometimes you get people pitying, or in some way making it sound as if they feel sorry for the person, and nobody wants to be pitied. And people want to be respected, and they want to have access. Pity is not something that's ever welcomed. And it's not something that people are looking for. Some very practical things that people deal with in a small town: transportation, public transportation. We do have accessible public transportation in Big Rapids, but there are limitations to that. I mean, if you are a person who relies on public transportation to get around, then you have to plan ahead. And you have to be very flexible, because what if, the dial-a-ride doesn't show up on time, which, might be more common than we would like it to be. And then that leads to more problems with employment, because employers don't like it when you're late. Or, in the classroom, because professors don't like it when you're late. So there's some issues with transportation. And it's sometimes just getting around, like, pedestrian lights that maybe aren't necessarily audible. So if you can't see the the white walking man, then you don't know that it's your turn to go. So that can be an issue too. So yeah, there's lots of little things in a small town, in a big town too, but I think we especially see it in a smaller town because we don't see disability openly. We don't talk about it enough. We don't see it enough.
Okay, thank you so much, Julie. Melissa?
All right, this is probably my longest answer because this is where we've lived this. And so I'm going to I just wanted to give you a little bit of insight into life with a disability. In this list, of course, I'm not naming names. I'm not trying to shame anyone, and I certainly don't want anybody to pity. But sometimes it's important to see the types of things that happen that people aren't even aware of. And that's the purpose of this list that I've made. And the people involved in this list were all very nice people. They were all very, your average nice people. So it wasn't a matter of being mean-spirited. It was just a matter of not thinking or not seeing. Julie was just talking about transportation and college classes. And my son, he hasn't taken too many college classes, but the first semester he took classes in downtown Grand Rapids. He does drive a wheelchair accessible van, but there weren't any, there are almost no parking spaces, especially van accessible parking spaces in downtown Grand Rapids. So he had to take a go bus. He had a professor that the first day he said, I don't take emails, I don't take phone calls. All I do is take, office hours. I'll see you on an office hour. And my son lost the syllabus the first day. He wanted to try to handle the problem by himself because he didn't want to ask anyone for help. And he couldn't get up to the professor before the professor left the class. If he had to come back for an office hour, that would be another go bus trip. And he ended up failing the class because he missed an assignment. And that basically discouraged him from taking any more college classes. So even though he's intelligent enough to take them, it was a hard start. Now we'll go all the way back to third grade. His third grade class was scheduled to go on a field trip to Ludington State Park. His teachers explained to me that since he would be unable to participate in most of the activities, he would be stuck in a tent most of the day. Philip elected not to go. Band carnival, every year the band members were expected to come the night before and set up the haunted house. Philip wound up just watching the others as no one in leadership figured out a way to get him involved in the process. For homecoming and other dances, the entrance was set up at a door which involved a step up, which Philip couldn't access. So he had to go around to another door and knock until someone let him in because all the other doors were locked. At a retreat Philip attended, everyone was asked to turn to the person next to them and discuss a question. I was sitting across the circle from him because, one of us had to go with him to attend to his physical needs. Philip turned to the adults on either side of him and was ignored. Many times Philip approached a circle of individuals who were talking only to find the circle close with him outside. We went on a mission trip which involved painting apartments. If we hadn't found ways for him to participate, he would not have found a job to do. He was asked to leave early because his chair was in the way. One time we visited a large church in the Grand Rapids area. It was arena style seating, so all the wheelchairs were seated at the back. The format for singing was words projected on a screen. The people directly in front of the wheelchair aisle stood to sing, so nobody in the wheelchairs could see the screen to sing. They had a greeting time, and only one person in that congregation of 700 or so came back to shake hands with the people in wheelchairs. Philip and I both attended an audition for a theatrical production. I heard back that I had received a role, he did not. The next thing I heard was that they didn't have enough young men and would need to recruit them to fill roles. I called at that point and asked the director, I said, what about Philip? He said that the stage would have multiple levels and that they would not be able to use him because of that. Again, I want to emphasize the fact that people weren't being deliberate or mean-spirited. But the problem is that for inclusion to take place, people have to be deliberate and purposeful. They have to be willing to think outside the box, to communicate, to be willing to change and to do things differently. Anybody in leadership needs to be all in to model how to include and treat disabled people. And all of this takes time, effort, and patience. And so, like I said, these things, I am sure we are not the only ones. They're not isolated, but that might give you just a little window into some of the issues that people with disability face when it comes to participation.
Thank you so much, Melissa. That's a lot of food for thought, particularly for those of us who are in positions to model and find ways to include everyone, such as myself as a professor and so forth, and other, Jonathan as a city leader, Jennifer as a city leader, Mayor Hogan as city leaders, those of us with leadership roles, trying to figure out how to be not just saying we're inclusive, but modeling and making sure that we're inclusive, making it a priority. Our third question is, could you share your perspective on the challenges for persons with invisible disabilities in the community? And this time we'll start with you, Melissa.
Okay. I asked my son Matthew to address this because he has ADHD, and that is becoming more widely recognized as an invisible disability. So he wrote an answer that I'm going to read. He's asked me to introduce this as the ramblings of a brain with ADHD about invisible disabilities. He said, I want to start by saying that I am no spokesperson for those with invisible disabilities. I believe this spectrum to be as broad, if not broader, than those seen. I am not an uncommon case either. It is estimated that as much as 10% of people living in the United States are in the same boat as me. I believe that people, particularly able-bodied people, view disability as something to feel bad about. This is apparent in the awkwardness around apparent disability in the culture. Most people also interpret those with the ability to suppress or mask their disability as neurotypical, but lacking discipline or willpower. My unique perspective comes in the form of being a living case study of how those treat invisible disabilities versus visible disabilities. My brother has a spinal cord injury and quadriplegia and is a lot more apparently disabled than me with my ADHD. Not once in my life has ADHD been treated as an acceptable reason for any shortcoming or mistake. I've been punished and laughed at for seemingly dumb mistakes, and I always chalked it up to some kind of character flaw or lack of effort, not a genuine disability. I will tell you that it's so taxing to lack control in these, quote, easy areas in life. It may not seem like a big deal, but it is in the atypical brain. Education on all types of disability is disgustingly sparse. There should be no shame or embarrassment in disability, regardless of how easy it is to spot.
I want to thank, is that Matthew's response to that question? I want to thank Matthew for taking the time to give us a very, very thoughtful response to that question. Julie?
I agree. That is a very thoughtful response to that question. It's hard to follow, even though I thought this was going to be my question, because the majority of the students that I work with have invisible disabilities. So this is an area that I'm pretty familiar with from a professional standpoint. But, those can be ADHD, as Melissa was sharing. Also chronic health conditions, learning disabilities, mental health conditions, autism, and a large variety of other things. And so yes, it is very prevalent in our society, but yet we don't see it or talk about it enough, and it's not normalized to the degree that it is normal, right? So there's some work to do. We still have this kind of societal preference for the happy, healthy, strong individuals. We have a pace of life that kind of favors that. And so when there's somebody with an invisible disability, it's interesting because in some instances, they feel like they have to, cover their symptoms or pass, as non-disabled. And, you think about the socially acceptable answers to the question, how are you? Those socially acceptable answers range from okay to great. But anything less than okay, we can't talk about that. We're discouraged from talking about not being okay. And maybe, it's okay to talk about not being okay with close friends or people that we trust. But I'd say even in those situations, you might start to get those very subtle cues that people are getting uncomfortable, right? And they might say things like, well, this is in your control. Meaning, it's your behavior. It's something that you're doing. It's your fault. And that's something that people with invisible disabilities get a lot. It might be ADHD. Well, it's your fault. You're just, not disciplined enough or responsible enough. It's depression. You're not trying. You're just lazy. So many times people with invisible disabilities get labeled incorrectly as being weak, fragile, a snowflake, lazy, words like that. And then when they do need an accommodation, something for classes, then the burden of proof is on the person with a disability. They have to prove it, right? And in my job, I try to make that as painless as possible and be pretty flexible in that, what we call an interactive process. But there's usually some type of documentation that's involved. And if you don't have access to healthcare, or you don't have access to, psychological testing or therapy, then how do you get that documentation? How do you prove your status as a person with a disability to get what you need, to get the accommodations that you need, whether that be in work or in school? And even if you do get those accommodations, sometimes, it's not enough just to have them on paper. If you don't have, and I'm using education as an example, if you don't have professor buy-in, if the professor doesn't believe you, then again, you're getting some of those subtle cues that, you don't deserve this. You're asking for more than you deserve. You're abusing the system. For example, if we have students who need modified attendance policies, or, maybe they take a little bit longer because of flares of symptoms to complete assignments and need an extension, people start to think that they're abusing the system when in fact it's an accommodation that is needed. And then the person with a disability feels like they have to somehow prove and say, no, I'm really disabled in this case. But then I have to prove I'm really capable and try to move away from that status, that identity, so that people see me as equal. And so it's constantly this tiptoeing, this code switching almost. And it can become very exhausting, to try to figure out, when do I have to prove and let people know that I do have a disability, that I do need accommodations, that it is real. And when do I want them to not see me as that? And so trying to balance that can be very challenging.
Thank you very much for that answer, Julie. And when you were talking, it made me think, because I work in education as well, higher education as well. One of the things that I have sort of developed to, or grown to, or moved into is for testing in general, particularly tests, because all of my tests are online. So I have come to the conclusion that timing tests is futile. There's no reason to time tests for either able-bodied or disabled students. this may be different in other disciplines, but I teach healthcare administration. There is nothing, no assignment that I can think of that I ever had to do as a healthcare administrator. I had a time limit, like 30 minutes, 40 minutes, 50 minutes, whatever. I might have a deadline. That's very different than, having 30 minutes to take a test. So I have been morphing to the point where I'm really removing those restrictions so that students who have need extra time can take as much time as they need. Students who don't need that, it's fine. But basically, in my view, that is a level playing field for everyone. They can manage their time and their effort in the way that's best for them. And I don't have to worry about having to, go in and change these little settings, which is a pain. Anyway, that's particularly true for undergraduate students. And as I thought about it, our graduate students generally have very little testing. You generally have written papers and so forth, where they can take as much time as they want to. So it just seems like a really weird sort of practice. We just perpetuate it instead of thinking about it. So just whatever that's worth.
I love that, Antoinette. That's it's universal design you're starting to talk about. If we design the curriculum for everybody, then it works for everybody. Nobody likes time tests.
There's really just don't see the purpose. When I first started teaching at the university level, you get the syllabi from someone else that says, this is how it's been done and done and done, and all of them, all the tests were timed and all of this. After a while, I'm like, why are we doing this? Particularly in our discipline. There was no reason that I could think of to do it. So I'm quickly abandoning all of that. So, the fourth question is regarding ADA compliance and accessibility. Are there any policies or community practices for improvement that you would recommend to Big Rapids, the city itself, or other decision makers at the university or other levels within the community? And this time, we'll start with you, Julie.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to have a little bit of a long-winded answer to this, but I have a point. So I'm going to start with the first thing that we need to understand is how is disability created. We usually think of that as disability is the impairment. If somebody is a wheelchair user, that's the disability, not the way we've designed the environment so that there's not wheelchair accessible entrances or the stage is not wheelchair accessible, right? But actually we create disability when we create an environment. So when we, whoever decided, hey, time tests are a good idea, that was creating disability because it doesn't work for everybody. It doesn't work for, the person with ADHD, or it doesn't work for a person who, takes a little bit longer because of a learning disability. And so we've created disability. So I think that's an important thing to understand. And so I want to talk, a little bit about, what disability means, what it means to have a disability, because we are all, every one of us are differently abled, right? So, and what I mean by that is I cannot sing. So I am differently able compared to Antoinette, who I know can sing. But does that mean I'm disabled? No, it doesn't, because I'm not oppressed by that. Now, if I go to karaoke and embarrass myself and people laugh at me, that might not be pleasant, but it's not oppression because it's not denying me access to anything. So I don't have to sing in order to get through the door. I don't have to sing the answers for my test, right? So, so having a disability is something, very, very specific. It means that you lack access to something. So why I think that's important is because sometimes if you don't lack access, you don't see disability. Like you just don't see it. You know if somebody has an impairment, but you don't really see disability because you're not realizing why the environment isn't accessible. And we don't see it because it's the water that we're swimming in, right? So, you know, like a fish doesn't see water, or we don't see air. So where I'm going with this is I'm talking about what are policies that would be helpful. The first thing I want to say is include people with disabilities in those leadership discussions, in those planning discussions. When you're doing city planning, urban planning, make sure that you are including people with disabilities in those discussions. In higher education, in K through 12, you know, there should be people on the school boards, in higher level administration at universities who have disabilities, because then they can say, this is what we need to do differently. Now, as far as, you know, what is a good policy to have, having a policy on website accessibility, you know, for example, that's an important policy to have around disability, making sure that you have accessible entrances, especially to all public buildings, access to everything that's public. If you're going to have a meeting that's open to the public of any kind, making sure that that's in an environment that is accessible to wheelchair users, certainly, but also to people who are blind, to people who are deaf. So, you know, having captioning on all media, including American Sign Language whenever possible, things like that, so that your environment is accessible to everyone. But then definitely listening to the voices of people with disabilities and engaging them in every step of the process as often as possible.
Thank you, Julie. Melissa?
Well, Julie gave a very thorough answer there. And I will tell you from the perspective of a family that on the occasions that somebody came to us and asked us about how they could make things better, that really just does something for your heart. And so that and this whole thing actually is wonderful because you know that people care and it's a huge thing. I don't have as much of an answer as Julie, but I will tell you that for physical disability, the buttons on the doors, the automatic door openers, are huge. We were actually at church. We attend Northland Community Church in McBain. My son was visiting, and the pastor happened to be in the bathroom at the same time he was. And he looked at him and said, "How do you get that door open?" And Philip just said, "Well, I just have to do it because it's there." And the pastor went immediately to the elders and said, we need to put buttons on every single door in this church. And so just that seemingly small thing is huge, you know, just knowing that people care and want to try to make things better. That would be, like I said, the number one thing. The other thing that's nice to have, especially when you have a situation like ours, family bathrooms are really nice to have where you can put them. Because if you have, say, I'm out with my son Philip, and as he got older and I had to help him in the bathroom, it was kind of okay, he's kind of old to take into the women's bathroom, but yet there was no choice in a lot of places. Fortunately, he's able to be independent in that area now, but for a while it was a struggle to know exactly how to handle it.
Thank you both for those thoughtful responses to those questions. What is the most important thing that able-bodied individuals should understand about those who are disabled? This time we'll start with you, Melissa.
Thank you, Antoinette. I actually asked my son Philip this question to get his perspective. This was one of the ones that he had a response. And his answer was that he was a human being. He would like to be treated just like any person. He also said that it's fine to ask questions about his disability. You know, you don't have to ignore it or pretend like the wheelchair is not there. He's fine with that. And I would add that many people are uncomfortable around people with disabilities, so they don't interact with them. It's very hard to face things that we are uncomfortable with. And it can be uncomfortable, especially if you're looking at like a nonverbal person and you're used to a conversation being two-sided. That takes some figuring out. Or somebody who has the retinal scanner and you ask them a question and it takes a long time for their response. Again, that can be uncomfortable, but I would really encourage people to make an effort to speak to people with disabilities, and not just to the family members pushing the wheelchair, but directly to those people. Look them in the eyes, say hello. Even if they can't respond, you will see facial expressions that show that they hear and that they know what you said and that they really appreciate that you took the time out to speak to them, because so many people don't.
Thank you, Melissa. Julie?
Okay, just to add on to Melissa's response, which I think was great. Remembering again, you know, I'm repeating myself, but we create disability. And I think that that's important to understand. Because it helps us to be thoughtful when we are creating environments and thinking about, you know, who we are excluding. I also want people to realize that there's a lot of people who are proud of disability. We talk about disability sometimes as though it's a negative thing, that it's something to be ashamed of, that it means we're less than others in some way. But there are a lot of people who say, you know, look, I've had to navigate a world designed for me. And there's a lot of resilience and strength that comes with that. Like it does with any marginalized community. When you are having to get around in a world that's not, you know, created with you in mind, you know, there's a certain strength and resilience that you build because of that. Now, I'm not saying, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that people are strong just because they have a disability, or that we should go around praising people just for having a disability. But I do think that we should respect that disability is not a dirty word. And there are some people who prefer person first language, you know, like we've been using tonight, person with a disability. There are some people who prefer what they call identity first language, and will say, I am disabled, and say that with pride, because it's something that they claim as part of their identity and proudly. So disability doesn't automatically make a person strong or brave or an inspiration to others, but it is certainly not a bad thing. It's a neutral thing, and something that we should respect and allow people to take pride in.
Thank you for those responses. Do you have any suggestions for practical steps that people can take to help bring awareness and positive change to individuals who are disabled in the community? This time, Julie.
Okay. So the first thing I would say is, whenever you get the opportunity, ask about access needs. And I don't mean just specific individuals that you think might have access needs, but, you know, posting on the website, you know, if you have need for accommodation or any access needs, you know, contact this person. In your advertising, in places of business, you know, having signs saying, you know, ask about accessibility if there's anything that you need. Having clear signage. Sometimes there are accessible entrances, places, but we don't know where they are. And so, you know, having the experience of going around the building and trying to figure out where to go in, how to find the elevator, you know, so having clear signage, you know, for those things. I've talked about having an accessible website, using live captions whenever possible, so that, you know, all people, that's just automatically there. It doesn't necessarily have to be asked for. You just make sure that it's there. And that can be, using some versions of Zoom have the live transcription that you can enable, and just have that readily available for everybody. It might feel kind of strange to do because not a lot of people do it, but at the beginning of this panel discussion, I, described myself visually. And that's something that I would encourage others to do, because not everybody has access to, what you look like or where you're coming from. And I haven't done this yet, but I want to learn sign language if you get the chance. At our Disability Resource Fair today, we had some folks from Deaf and Hard of Hearing out of Grand Rapids, and they will teach. We want to get them to come up here and teach sign language classes, which I think would be great for the community. And the more people that do that, the more inclusive of a community we can have. We talked about being proactive and thinking ahead. I think Melissa had some beautiful things to say about, people are not mean-spirited, but they just don't always think ahead and try to be proactive and try to be inclusive. And the more that we can do that and keep disability in our awareness, the better. Believe people when they tell you what they need. If somebody discloses an invisible disability to you, your first thought shouldn't be prove it. It should be, okay, what do you need? How do we work with you? And the last thing, respect. Respect people. People don't want pity. They don't want unearned praise. They want respect. They want access. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Melissa?
I would certainly echo that last comment of Julie's. Respect is huge. And I did ask Philip this question, and he said, I don't want awareness. I prefer not to think about the fact that I'm disabled. I have to remember it all the time. He wants to be treated like any other person. As I said, a practical step would be to start to speak to people who are disabled, to start to speak, to just even say hello, to greet them, to see that human being inside. About 8 years ago, we got involved in Johnny and Friends Ministries. Johnny is a quadriplegic. She was in a diving accident, and since then she has developed a worldwide ministry serving disabled people and their families, and they have a retreat every summer. And Philip and I started to go. And the main reason we started was because at 17, we'd been on mission trips where, as I said earlier, if we hadn't found something for Philip to do, there would not have been any meaningful way for him to participate. And I wanted him to see that he had gifts to give, not just always to be the one that was ministered to, but to minister to others. And it was great because the lady who is the regional director, I just explained the situation. So like, of course we can find him a job to do. And since then, our whole family has begun to go every summer. And one of the main lessons, I learned something different every year, is about humanity, is about the way that God sees us, sees disability. Sometimes we have such a backwards idea of what's valuable. And I'll just give you a couple of snippets from that so that you can see what I mean. They have a talent show at the end of every retreat for people with disabilities. And the first year I went, there was a young man. He had autism, and he had spent most of the week being politely redirected. Now you can't grab that from her. You need to do this. And, it was very nice, but it was just very direct. But he got up and he sang the song, God of Wonders. And he belted it out and he sang it off key. And I thought it was the most beautiful thing that I had ever heard. And I cried. I sing too, Antoinette. And I had to ask myself, have I ever worshiped God this wholeheartedly without thinking about how I sound, without thinking about my performance? And I had to answer no. He wasn't thinking about anything else other than who God was, and he was worshiping with his whole heart. So every year I learn something, some idea that I've had that maybe isn't reality. You know, we always have things that we can learn. Another one was this last year. There was a young lady who loves dogs. She used to have a lot of meltdowns. I do therapy dog ministry there. And when the therapy dog comes in, the meltdowns stop. But one time she got upset and the therapy dogs didn't work and my presence didn't work. But there was a young man with Down syndrome, and both of these people are nonverbal, and he came up and he just had the most gentle expression, and he was stroking her arm, and just you could see the love radiating out of his eyes. And I realized that somehow I had gotten the idea that people who were nonverbal couldn't have as deep of relationships because relationships involve talking. How wrong I was. You know, here's these two people have deepest relationship you can have with another human being, and neither of them can say 2 or 3 words. So all of these things, you know, you begin to learn as you are exposed. And so that's one thing that I would recommend, that people take the time to talk to disabled people. If you have a chance to be involved in something like Special Olympics, do it. That's the best way for you to begin to learn lessons like I've been learning. And like I said, we've lived with disability for a long time, but there's always new things to learn. I wanted to talk, kind of ended up with a couple of things, small things and then big things that I've seen that make huge differences. And these were practical steps again. I already told you about our pastor with the asking for the church to install buttons on the doors. And that was, you know, again, it might seem small to some people, but for somebody to see that need without being told, that's huge. Now I'm going to talk about another field trip to Ludington. In 4th grade, they had another field trip to Ludington, and different teacher. And this teacher, Mr. McIntosh, he planned ahead how to include Philip in every activity. He actually offered to carry him to the top of the lighthouse so he could see the view, which he declined. But he did carry him up the stairs to a higher trail so that he could see the view from there. Because he's like, no, you're going to come and you're going to experience everything. And seeing that, planning ahead, seeing that care, seeing that, yeah, we want to make this, you're part of this class and we want to make your experience just as good as everyone else's. The final one, this is kind of a big one, but it was a really neat experience. Before my student teaching, they require, any of you who've been through teaching degree know that you're required to go and observe. And I went to a middle school in Kalamazoo. There were 2 students who were severely mentally and physically disabled. They were nonverbal and in wheelchairs. In the class that I attended, it was a math class. One student was assigned to work with a disabled student each day. They were not, and that student was not responsible to do their homework that day. And every classroom had a similar arrangement. And as I was walking down the halls, I noticed that every student walking down the hall greeted these kids, giving them high fives. Hey, how are you? Good to see ya. And I was floored. And I found out later that a lot of legwork had gone into that. They had had meetings with the school, with the staff, with the parents. They had assemblies where they talked to the students about these students and their disabilities and you know what it was like. And the payoff was just enormous. I have never seen a middle school environment that was so friendly, so compassionate, so wonderful. These kids were more accepting of everyone around them. I would say that they got more out of it than the students themselves, the twins that were disabled. And you see, that's the real gift, is that when we take the time, there's payoffs for everyone. These students are adults today, and they are doing the same things likely in their communities that they did in that school. And it makes better people out of them. And so all of that work that they put into this, like I said, I've never seen anything like it, but these are just some ways that I have seen that really work.
Thank you very much for that, Melissa. And that concludes our prepared questions. As we were talking and as I prepared this, before we go into opening it up for questions, I just want to share personal experience. As a healthcare worker, I have always had to, of course, deal with patients of all abilities and disabilities because of my role. But when I started thinking about it, it actually goes back a lot further, because one of my classmates in high school was injured in a football accident. And that young man graduated from high school with us and returned after his rehab to classes with us. And we included him and, I mean, it was just Doug, So thinking about sort of my frame of reference for dealing with individuals with disabilities, it goes back to Doug's injury and having known him since middle school, he's the same Doug, he just uses a wheelchair now. And that carried over when I became a healthcare administrator, because my first job in Mississippi at the University of Mississippi Medical Center, attached on our campus, was a Methodist Rehabilitation Center, where many individuals with spinal cord injuries and other illnesses that impacted mobility would come there for their rehab treatment, but much of their other treatment was in our hospital. So, I was accustomed, on an ongoing basis. And that probably impacted my 10 years or so on the board of an organization called the Lakeshore Foundation in Birmingham. The Lakeshore Foundation is now an internationally renowned organization that serves over 4,000 unique individuals annually through physical activity and sport, recreation, advocacy, policy, and research. It's also an Olympic and Paralympic training site, and they say they strengthen the ongoing commitment to development of para sports. This is a very this particular, being involved in the Lakeshore Foundation taught me a lot, in addition to what I already had experienced, about the fact that there really are no limits to what people can do, given the opportunity and the resources to engage. At the Lakeshore Foundation, people can compete or participate to whatever level they desire, and their physical or mental capabilities limit them. But that activity is there. Everyone from someone who just wants to use the pool and swim, or use a track to just improve their mobility, to individuals who actually go to the Paralympics and compete at that level. So, just like able-bodied people, their interest in certain things, and some people are more capable athletically than others are, and more capable mentally than others are, and it's the same. It's exactly the same thing. And I think that's one of the gifts of having lived the experiences that I have. That doesn't mean I can't continue to grow. And I hope and pray that I, will, continue to do so. And I really thank our panelists, Melissa and Julie, for participating today. And I will shut up now and ask if there are questions from any of the other participants. And by the way, Mayor Hoganson had to leave. He put something in the chat. I don't know if everyone noticed that or not, but he really extended his thanks to Julie and Melissa for participating. Any questions from the attendees?
Well, this isn't so much a question as just that what I took away from this is that we all bring a community, a part of our bigger community. We have smaller communities that we can affect change. And I couldn't help but think of, at Artworks, yes, we have an elevator, but we don't have accessible doors for people. You have to have an able-bodied person open those doors. So, little things like that, we each can bring something to the smaller communities that we are a part of going forward. So I appreciate y'all giving us insight and, ways that we can help. And it doesn't have to be rocket science and huge again. It's just, we each do a little bit. I do know that when new, like, what do they call them at the street lights? The way the concrete was poured when the city redid those, they put the bumps on
bumps.
yeah. So, differently abled people could feel that, especially like blind people, those that are, but again, like what you said, Julie, the audio, an auditory one, that would be great, things like that. I just never thought of, but I do think I do work with the folks from Hope Network, and now also the Macasa Osceola high school kids. And again, it's just, if you have an opportunity to be with these folks, I always feel like I am the one who is enriched so much, I mean, I help them do art, but it's nothing, so I think if we get more comfortable with folks that, are differently abled, that it's less daunting. So, okay, it's not a question, sorry. So.
Thank you for that comment, Ruth. Appreciate
Can I
it.
say something?
Yes, Jennifer.
First of all, I really appreciated Julie's framing the notion of disabilities as something that we create. That really hit home with me, because I remember even back when I worked in teacher ed for a long time, and there was a great deal of conversation around special ed, special needs kids, and the fact that we operate on a system of norms, and therefore anything that is not norm is deficient. And we tend to look at, and we tend to identify and look at those people like their identity is their deficiency. But it's not. People's disabilities do not define them, as we have heard very eloquently from Melissa and from Julie this evening. And what I'm also aware of, I really learned this firsthand when my mother developed serious dementia, and she was no longer verbal. We could no longer have normal conversations. And I had to really slow down physically to guide her and to protect her while she was walking, and all of that kind of stuff. And it really brought home to me how much this culture in the United States is addicted to speed and convenience. And we become very impatient with anything that interrupts the speed and the convenience. I want to thank Melissa in particular so much for sharing her son's voices with us. It just opened your eyes, it opens your awareness so profoundly, and the work that Julie is doing at school. The conversation that I had with Leslie at the resource fair, we had a long discussion about how do we help business people come to an understanding about people with various kinds of disabilities, and get people over their fear and their discomfort. And that's, I think, a phenomenon we've been facing in this social equity initiative with many things, having difficult conversations. I'm always hearing Lieutenant Governor Gilchrist's words in my head about that first step between 0 and 1 is the biggest step, initiating these conversations. And I just think that, the more of us that can be participating in these and initiating these conversations, or reaching out to people who can facilitate these conversations, would be hugely helpful. I so appreciate both you ladies for speaking with us. I've found this hugely enlightening. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jennifer. Anyone else with any questions or comments? Since I don't hear any, I will yield the floor back to Jonathan. But once again, I want to thank everyone for participating this evening. I want to thank the committee for giving me this opportunity. It has been a real growth experience for me, and I truly appreciate everyone and everyone who's participated in all of our sessions during this past year. So
Thank you, Antoinette.
Thank you, Jonathan. You now have the floor.
Thank you very much, Antoinette. As always, you've done a fantastic job, and thank you so much for everything you've done for us over the past year. It truly has been my personal honor to get to know you in this past year and see your incredible perspective and bring that to our group as we're planning. Really, you were the one I was always trying to impress the most when we were having our organization committee meetings and thinking about questions that we would ask.
You realize I wasn't going to give you a
But
grade, right?
I wish you well in your future endeavors, and you will be greatly missed.
Thank you.
To
very
Melissa.
much. You get an A+.
Thank you. Speaking in educator terminology, yes. Thank you also to Melissa and Julie for participating this evening. Incredible insight. I am walking away with so many more thoughts that I didn't even conceive before this evening. So thank you so much. Melissa, please extend our thanks to your sons, Matthew and Philip, for their insight this evening. I wish they were able to have joined us, but you did a wonderful job conveying their thoughts and feelings as well. For those who don't know, I know everybody on the Zoom call does know, but we are Facebook live streaming this event. So those out there who don't know, the Big Rapids Social Equity Initiative grew out of the Black Lives Matter March, organized in June 2020 on the campus of Ferris State University. A group of concerned residents, city officials, and representatives from the university decided that we needed to continue the conversation about equity, and later that summer held the first meeting of the overall Big Rapids Social Equity Initiative. And out of that grew 3 community pillars: community engagement, public safety, and institutional change. All with the vision of creating an empowered and engaged community working together to achieve equity on every level. Our group, these, excuse me, Community Engagement Committee has been organizing these events since January of, and we plan to continue to organize events similar to these for many, many months to come. We've done some great work with the help of some great people like Antoinette and our other committee members, but we've got a lot more work to do. Our next event will be held on November 18th, 3 weeks from tonight, 7 p.m., also held via Zoom. November is Native American Heritage Month, and we have Dr. Kaylee Henry, who's the coordinator for Project Aware in the Mount Pleasant area, who will be giving a presentation on equity within the Native American community in our region and across Michigan. Kaylee is a 2000 graduate of Big Rapids High School, and then went on to earn her doctorate in anthropology from Michigan State University. So we're very excited to have her give a presentation, and I just spoke with her yesterday morning to finalize our event details, and she's very excited about what we have going on here and is very much looking forward to speaking 3 weeks from tonight. Following her presentation, we will open the meeting up to a Q&A period with Kaylee, as well as a current Ferris student and Native American young woman, Hannah Tecumseh. So we will have some good panel, good discussion going on there. I hope you all join us. The details of this event will be shared on the Social Equity Facebook page in the coming days, but please join us on November 18th. And with that, again, thank you everybody for participating this evening. And we stay tuned for more information on the Big Rapids Social Equity page, and we'll see you all soon. Thank you. And thank you again, Antoinette. I wish you the best.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.